Scotch is short for Scottish, as in Scottish whiskey, so Scotch is simply any whiskey that is made and bottled within the country of Scotland. It is purely a geographic determination for whiskey, and really nothing more. Fundamentally, whiskey is only three ingredients: grain, water, and yeast. You ferment it like beer, then distill it, age it, and you create a beautiful golden liquid deemed historically as the water of life. Now that's the rules for making really any whiskey, but particularly for Scotch, it must adhere to these three criteria. It must be aged for at least 3 years, it must be made in Scotland, and finally it must have an ABV of at least 40%. Scotch has an interesting quirk with its spelling of the word whiskey, as in it's not referred to as whiskey, but rather as whisky. The reason for this is British people. The word whiskey comes from the Gaelic word ishka, which means water, and transliterated to English, ishka becomes whiskey. It'd be common in British English to spell whiskey without the extra silent E, and so most Scotch distillers would market their product as whiskey, no E. The Irish and Americans, however, would include the extra E and label their whiskies as whiskey with E. These spellings became trends by production region, and now over the years, whiskey with E refers to Irish and American made, and whiskey no E refers to most anything else, particularly Scotch. Now you might notice on a whiskey bottle the term single malt. Malt is the name given to grain used for whiskey after the first step of production is completed, as this step is called malting. Malting is the process of soaking the freshly harvested grain in a nice little bath in order to start the germination process. This happens because the grain sees the bath as ideal conditions to start sprouting, and so releases the enzymes that convert starches into sugars, and the sugars are important because it's what you need for the alcohol. And so this sprouted grain is called malt, and the single in single malt refers to one, as in one type of grain for the malt. If by grain you mean barley, because it only means barley. Historically, Scotch was exclusively made from barley, so when the bottle said single malt, it was no question that it was only barley. But now it's expanded, so Scotch can be made from literally any grain, but the single malt description still only applies to barley and barley only. If it's something else, you'll see something like single grain or blended. Mash, wort, and wash are some awful words, but they're the products created from the next steps of whiskey production. First, the malt is taken, dried, and ground to grist, then steeped in water at variously increasing temperatures, which create this sugary, syrup-like substance called wort. Thick, sweet, and ideal for drowning in, and also ideal for fermentation. Add some yeast to the wort, and you have a process similar to leaving some old grape juice out to make wine. The yeast eats away at the sugary wort and spits out alcohol. It's elementary. After a few days, you're left with a substance called wash, which is all light and bubbly and caps at around 5 to 10% alcohol. To get that alcohol percentage higher, you'll have to distill it. The distillation process is not that complicated, but don't trust me to do it myself. The objective is simply to raise the alcohol content of the wash from around 10% to 30% to 70%, with enough room for you to water it down after. Now, similarly to how you distill water by boiling it, or how you smelt ore in Minecraft to make ingots, distillation is simply heating up a liquid to a controlled temperature where your desired elements start to boil. Now, as a gas, they rise up the distillation still and are condensed back into a liquid. For Scotch, this needs to happen at least twice and cannot exceed a final ABV of 94.8%. Now, I first thought this process was similar to reducing a stew or making distilled water, but no, obviously, because the boiling point of water is higher than that of alcohol. So you're not simply boiling off the water, you're boiling off the alcohol and catching it and bringing it back to a liquid. Now that the whiskey is distilled and we're ready to age it, we fill up some casks and leave it in the cellar for maturation. Now, because this is where the flavor develops and it's supposed to sit for years and years on end, some can't help but sneak in and get a little taste for themselves. Legends of old claim that late in the night, deep in the cellars, whiskey from the casks would mysteriously and inexplicably disappear. Where did it go? Well, for most of history, we assumed it to be the good little Catholic angels up in the air swooping down and taking a little taste for themselves, and so this was known as the angel share. But in the modern day, we know now that angels aren't real, and the whiskey is actually being lost to evaporation. Pores in the wood and moisture in the air create the conditions for either the water to evaporate if the air is dry, or the alcohol to evaporate if the air is wet. Typically in Scotland, the environment is cold and wet, and so it's mostly the alcohol that is evaporated in the angel share. It also notably creates this mold on the walls called whisky fungus, which is a real species of fungus with a preference particularly for airborne alcohol. And so in the end, we know now that the angels were never drinking after all. It was only the whisky fungus. Scotch is fancy. Snobbery is fancy, and that includes distinguishing whiskies according to their region, because much like wine, different regions bear different flavors. You want something floral? Well, that's common in the lowlands. This one tastes fishy. Must be from Campbellton. But the one that stands out the most in popularity by far is Speyside. Now, Speyside technically is part of the Highlands region, but this one particular valley hosts such a density of distilleries, with most of their single malts dominating global whiskey sales, that it has eventually come to be defined as a region of its own. These distilleries are all located around and use water from the nearby river Spey, and the flavors common in these whiskeys are often considered to be both mild and elegant, with notes of caramel and honey. Popular distilleries include the Macallan, Glenfiddich, Belveney, Glenlivet, which all encompass among the 10 most popular single malts sold worldwide. This word here is pronounced Islay, but the locals call it Islay. Islay is the ethnic pronunciation of the Scottish islands called Islay, and it operates as its own region of Scotch. This distinction is mostly due to its historical significance and relative geographic isolation. Additionally, it's also home to just 10 distilleries, but they're pretty damn good ones, as whiskey production is the second largest employer on the island. Islay is also a big area for whiskey tourism due to classic Scottish landscapes and proximity of the distilleries. Wait, did I just say Islay? Islay, it's pronounced Islay. Campbelltown is a Scotch region named after the town of Campbelltown on the southern Scottish peninsula. Currently, it's home to the fewest distilleries of any Scotch region, but that wasn't always the case actually. Campbelltown whiskies used to be highly sought after, many people associating it with good taste and quality, and the region was rockin' and rolling in bacon biscuits up until the 1900s. Until then, a combination of factors changed everything, and everyone seemingly changed their opinions on Campbelltown whiskies within a minute. Most Campbelltown distilleries were struggling to keep up with demands as their popularity kept growing, and they soon started cutting corners in their production to keep up. Understandably so, people noticed and started to prefer other Scotch regions, causing sales to decline, and then boom, Prohibition. Those dirty Europeans that can't maintain an economy without American consumerism were now dealing with a record decline in whiskey sales, and none were hit harder than that of Campbelltown. Over the following years, most Campbelltown distilleries closed, and the few remaining only barely survived. Up until recently, the perception regarding Campbelltown whiskies was that they were briny, oily, fishy, and just generally unpleasant, unlike the fine whiskies of Islay that are dynamic and coastal. It's all just stigma in the end. Some new distilleries are opening and old ones are reopening, preying on this millennial generation that loves craft brews and IPAs and shit like that. But regardless of that, nothing will stop me from forever remembering Campbelltown whiskies as tasting like funky seascapes and wet dog. Most popular Scotch by far is Johnnie Walker, but it is not a distillery, it's a blender. Johnnie Walker doesn't necessarily make his own whiskey himself, but rather collects a unique combination of various other whiskeys and mixes them together for a more idealized and universally appealing spirit. Now, historically, this concept made a lot of sense. People were making their own whiskeys illegally in their green tops of houses, so good whiskey, or at least a whiskey that you would like, would not be as easy to come by. So if you knew how to blend together the right flavors and textures, perhaps you could have a whiskey empire on your hands. And no one was more equipped for this than Johnnie Walker's son. John Walker, born 1805 in Kilmarnock, Scotland, was just a humble grocer. He had a little shop and sold all sorts of things, and though alcohol was among these things, John Walker himself was a teetotaler, which meant he abstained from alcohol. His son, though, Alexander, was a skilled tea blender, and probably not a teetotaler like his father, because he would be the one to go on and blend specialty whiskeys for his father's shop. At first, these whiskeys were nothing significant, and they only made up a small fraction of the shop's sales, but they soon started to grow in popularity, and after a flood in 1852 destroyed pretty much everything in the entire shop, John Walker was convinced by his son to switch to primarily selling blended whiskey. In the years to follow, John Walker was to die, and his son Alexander took over the shop and turned out to be a marketing genius. The blended whiskey sales were already on the rise, but how could it get any higher? First, he established a brand. It's no longer specialized whiskey blended just for you. You don't tell us what you want, we tell you what you want. Second, the whiskey was sold in square bottles, both for practical reasons like keeping the bottles from breaking, but also for the unique look. And third, and most ingenious of them all, is that label on the bottle, which is cleverly applied at a 24-degree angle. Not for any particular reason at all, it just looks interesting to new customers and is easily identifiable to return customers. These features seem kind of unnecessary and somewhat flashy, even though Johnnie Walker whiskey is decidedly not, but it was what quickly established itself as a recognizable brand for a decent product, which is what business is all about, even if the guy in the bottle had nothing to do with it. Another marketing gimmick of Johnnie Walker is the simple differentiation of its different blends. Sometimes words are too much, so different colors is all you need, and each different blend of Johnnie Walker is defined by its own color. Red Label is the simplest and cheapest and the most popular. It's marked without an age statement and might cost around $30 for a bottle. Black Label is almost as popular as the red. It's a tad bit fancier though, aged 12 years, and costs closer to $40. A Green Label is where it starts to get really fancy, aged at least 15 years, and it'll cost you close to $80. And notably, Green Label is a blended malt whiskey, not blended grain, so it's just barley in this one. And finally, Blue Label is the fanciest of them all, around $200 per bottle. No age statements nor list of whiskey used, so it could very well be that they just rebottle the Red Label and let the subconscious do all the work. When compared to American and Irish whiskeys, Scotch is a lot more mellow and fruity. I think, at least, that's how I taste it. It's like flower petals is how I usually describe it, and the reason why is a lot of different factors. Irish whiskeys are allowed to use unmalted barley, keeping flavors more oily and zesty instead of fruity and nutty. Irish whiskey is also triple distilled, while Scotch is only twice distilled, meaning it maintains more of its original flavor compounds. American whiskey tastes a lot different for obvious reasons, with the inclusion of corn and freedom and the maturation in newly charred barrels, making it taste like fire and knife. But that big difference between Scotch and Irish whiskey really just comes down to the subtle differences in ingredients and distillation process. The word dram comes from the ancient Greek drachme, which was a small unit of weight roughly equivalent to a few grams. In imperial units, it has come to be defined as 1/16 of an ounce, and was popularized in Scotch culture because of commercial establishments in the past called dram shops that would sell alcoholic beverages, mainly Scotch, by the dram. And now, over the years, a dram now colloquially refers to any small volume of a serving of Scotch. On the rocks is a gay way of saying you want ice in your drink, which is a common way of serving Scotch. Now, they might be called rocks because ice kind of resembles a rock, but the leading theory has to do with the old Scottish way of chilling a drink before ice was invented. What you'd do is you'd find rocks from riverbeds or perhaps up in the mountains that are thoroughly cold, and those would act as your ice cubes. Put the rocks in your glass, and look at that, you got a way of chilling a drink without watering it down. Would you look at that? Now, one final point before I let you go. If you ever find yourself needing to make good whiskey discussion and you're asked, oh, what's your favorite whiskey? Just make sure you don't say anything like Jameson or Crown Royal or Johnnie Walker Red. I would suggest saying instead something like Dalmore 12, Lagavulin 16, or if you can't think of anything else, Johnnie Walker Black. And also make sure you know how to pronounce these words. Bunnahabhain, Lefroig, Glenmorangie, and Islay.